You shouldn't be out this late. The thought repeats in your head like a warning bell, growing louder with each crunch of your footsteps on the dirt path. The moon hangs low, casting silver light through the gnarled branches overhead, but it does nothing to soothe the prickling on the back of your neck. It's as though the trees are alive, watching, waiting. You clutch the bundle of herbs to your chest, a last-minute errand your grandmother insisted upon, claiming the sickness won't leave your brother unless these leaves are brewed fresh tonight. You told her you'd fetch them after work, and now you regret that promise. The air feels wrong. It's too still, too heavy, as if the jungle has forgotten how to breathe. No frogs croak, no crickets chirp. Even the wind has gone silent. You hear it before you see it, a sound like wet fabric tearing. It cuts through the quiet, setting your teeth on edge. You freeze mid-step, straining your ears. Another sound follows, the faint creak of branches shifting. Whatever it is, it's above you. You don't want to look. Every instinct screams to keep walking, to pretend you heard nothing, but your eyes betray you. Slowly, you tilt your head back. At first you see nothing but darkness, and then the shape comes into focus. A figure crouched high in the canopy, limbs too long, joints bent the wrong way. Its face glows faintly in the moonlight, a pale oval split by a jagged grin. Eyes black as oil bore into yours, unblinking. The mouth moves, but no words come out, only that wet, tearing sound. It moves. The Aswang drops from the tree with inhuman grace, landing silently on the path ahead of you. Its arms dangle low, fingers tipped with claws that glint like broken glass. The grin stretches wider, impossibly wide, revealing teeth like needles. You try to run. Your legs won't listen. The world seems to tilt as the creature steps closer, head cocked to the side, as if curious. It moves slowly, savoring the moment, relishing your fear. The Aswang's laughter fills the night, a sound like dry leaves and broken bones. It lunges. You barely dodge, falling into the dirt as its claws rake at the air where your head was just moments before. Scrambling to your feet, you run. You know the thing is behind you. You can hear it, the pounding of its limbs on the ground, the hungry growl in its throat. You don't dare look back. The village lights are so close now, a warm glow piercing in the darkness. If you can just make it there, you'll be safe. That's what you tell yourself. But the Aswang is fast. Too fast. A claw hooks the back of your shirt, yanking you off your feet. You hit the ground hard, the air knocked from your lungs. You flip onto your back, just in time to see it loom over you, its grin splitting open into a maw of writhing black tongues. You scream, and for a moment, the jungle itself seems to scream with you. Then, everything goes black. welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore from all over the world and we unpick, unravel and examine their origins, their stories and how they have changed over time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and it is almost the end of January. I actually don't know how it's still January. It's been January for about a year now. And I'm so ready for it to be over. I'm also ready for it to be warm. The room where I record this podcast is so cold, and I'm over not being able to feel my toes while I talk to you guys. Anyway, today I am super excited to be diving into Filipino folklore for the very first time on the show. Halloween has come extremely early, and we're exploring one of the most terrifying and prevailing figures in Filipino folklore, the Aswang. And this was requested over on Spotify, so thank you so much for the suggestion. This has been really cool to learn about. As I've been learning about the Aswang, you know that scene in Twilight when she's Googling vampires and all of these different articles pop up? That was me this week. That was me doing my research on the Aswang. I feel like I referenced Twilight far too much in this show. But anyway, I digress. What is it about this shape-shifting creature that has truly struck fear into the hearts of Filipinos for generations? And how has the Aswang evolved over time, and can she still be found in the shadows of the modern world? Cozy on down, and let's find out. Maybe keep the lights on, though. The Aswang may be a little bit different to the Ladies of Lore we've covered on previous episodes, because it's not just a single creature, but it's more of a collection of various scary beings from Filipino folklore. The word Aswang can refer to shape-shifting monsters, a blood-sucking vampire, or even a ghoulish witch, so it's a more of a general term, and the stories and the definitions of Aswang vary greatly from region to region and from person to person. So the term can't really be attributed to any particular set of characteristics, but if we want to get as strictly speaking as we can, an Aswang is someone who can change shape at will. There are quite a few theories on where the term Aswang comes from, and some say that it originates from the Tagalog word aso, meaning dog, and wang, a Visayan word meaning crazy, or possibly even wang wang, an older term for howling sounds. And then others theorise that it may come from the words asin, meaning salt, and bawang, meaning garlic, which are two everyday kitchen items that are often used to ward off many of the evil creatures that make up the Aswang. And if I'm being honest, I found quite a lot of other potential origins of the name. So if you do look this way, my lights just flickered in this room, which, when you're talking about something scary, isn't really what you want. My goodness. So anyway, if you look this up and you find that there are other definitions of the name, I wouldn't be surprised. There were so many that I found, so I just picked a couple. But if you do look this up, you'll probably find that there are others. The origins of the Aswang can be traced back to pre-colonial times. Early Filipinos believed in spirits, both benevolent and malevolent, and they existed in the natural world. And the Aswang were the malevolent ones, and sometimes they were used to provide an answer to unexplained deaths and illnesses and nighttime terrors, and over time she became the embodiment of everything that lurks in the dark. One of the earliest written documents that bears mention of the Aswang comes from Spanish missionaries in the 16th century. And Juan de Plasencia, one of these very missionaries, described belief in the Aswang in the Doctrina Christiana, the very first published book about the Philippines. And this is what he said. The distinctions made among the priests of the devil were as follows. The eighth they called Aswang, which is equivalent to sorcerer. They say that they have seen him fly, and that he murdered men and ate their flesh. The second they called the Manggagawe, or witches, who deceived by pretending to heal the sick. These priests even induced maladies by their charms, which in proportion to the strength and efficacy of the witchcraft are capable of causing death. In this way, if they wished to kill at once, they did so, or They could prolong life for a year by binding to the waist a live serpent, which was believed to be the devil, or at least his substance. This office was general throughout the land. So listening to that, it's very clear that these creatures were already deeply rooted in folklore, long before this document was written and way before the Spaniards came. This is feeling a little bit like La Llorona. Remember how her origins were in Aztec mythology and were written down only when the Spaniards came. So clearly, Spaniards like to write about scary mythological women. But once the Spaniards came, they recorded stories of these terrifying creatures and also noticed how widespread the belief in them was. In fact, some historians argue that Spanish colonizers might have actually used the fear of the Aswang as a method to control local populations, framing their Christian missionaries as protectors against these monsters and therefore encouraging conversion to Christianity out of fear. And they connected the Aswang to the Babylonians, who were female spiritual leaders, in a further effort to push Christianity. And they also began to associate the Aswang to women who protested against them when they arrived, so they could squash any political resistance as well as resistance to Christianity. And what makes the Aswang so unique and so terrifying is her ability to take on many forms. By day, she might appear as a beautiful young woman with long hair and is able to blend seamlessly into the village within which she lives. To be honest, it's not common at all for Aswangs to be known to attack anyone during the day, but come nightfall, she transforms into something far more sinister. As I said, this is a blanket term that covers a lot of different creatures, which vary even more regionally, so I can't cover them all today. Forgive me if you are an Aswang fan and I miss off your favourite. Please let me know in the comments if there are any you'd like to hear that I don't cover today. Having said that, let's break down some of her most well-known manifestations. So first up, we have the shape-shifting Aswang, and this version is one of the most versatile and mysterious types of Aswang, and can transform into animals such as dogs, pigs, birds, and they use their shape-shifting ability along with unparalleled stealth to blend into the environment, stalk and attack humans. And they're also sometimes said to be able to mimic the appearance or voice of specific people to help to deceive and lure their victims. For instance, they might pretend to be your loved one to get into your house and to isolate you. And they can also sometimes elongate or distort their shadows to add a layer of confusion to their hunt. But their true identity can sometimes be revealed by looking into their eyes, where your reflection will appear upside down. In my head, when I'm thinking about these, I picture the bit in Harry Potter where he sees Sirius Black in dog form when he escapes the Dursleys. That's what I'm seeing. And the concept of shapeshifting in Aswang folklore is representative of themes of deception and hidden danger. They embody the fear of betrayal, as they appear human but harbour monstrous intentions. They're a warning not to trust strangers, and even that sometimes danger can come from within one's community. And next up we have the tick-tick, which is named after the sound that it makes. And this variant of the Aswang is often described as a bird-like creature with sharp claws and a beak, but is also sometimes depicted as more humanoid with bat wings and predatory features. The tick-tick, like I said, is the eerie sound it makes while hunting. And what's really cool about the tick-tick, and also really scary about the tick-tick, is the sound is actually used to confuse the prey, because when it's louder, the creature is actually further away. So the quieter the sound is, the closer it is. And that creates a sense of paranoia and uncertainty, making it hard for victims to escape. And the tick-tick seeks to feed on unborn children and uses its long tube-like tongue to pierce through roofs or even open windows to reach its victim. Like other Aswang creatures, the tick-tick is vulnerable to things like salt, garlic, crucifixes, rosaries, holy water, and, in some cases, loud noises. And some believed that banging pots and pans together could scare it away. And they're also said to be vulnerable to sharp objects like knives, and often, to prevent the tick-tick from coming in through the roof, people would put cacti or other thorny plants on their roofs. and the tick-tick was often used as a cautionary tale to expectant mothers to avoid wandering alone at night or leaving windows and doors open. And then we have the Manananggal, perhaps the most iconic version of the Aswang. The Manananggal is truly terrifying. The name comes from the word Tangagal, meaning to detach. Why detach, do I hear you ask? Well, during the day, the Manananggal is a beautiful woman, but by night, she separates her upper torso from her lower body, and with leathery bat-like wings, she flies into the darkness, intestines hanging out, hunting for pregnant women to feed on their unborn children. And perhaps the most gross detail of this is that she actually leaves the lower half behind, which is extremely vulnerable to attack if found. So while the lower half just chills, I guess, the upper half flies around hunting for unborn children and their mothers, but will sometimes settle for sleeping individuals, where it likes to drink their blood and feast on their livers and hearts. Much like the other versions of the Aswang that I've mentioned, the Manananggal is a reflection of cultural anxieties, especially surrounding the dangers of childbirth and maternal health in pre-modern times. And its dual nature as a beautiful woman by day and hideous monster by night serves as a warning about trusting appearances, particularly in romantic relationships. So, as I'm sure you've gathered, the Aswang are pretty nasty creatures, and you could quite imagine the level of fear they created in Filipino villages. And the last of the Aswang that I will mention is the Bangkilan, and this one is a little bit less known, but it was one I really enjoyed reading about, so I wanted to tell you guys. And she's often mentioned in more regional tales, particularly in the Visayas. She appears as a grotesque and eerie elderly woman. It's often said that she was once a beautiful woman, but was cursed for a grave sin, such as infidelity, betrayal, or jealousy. The curse transforms her into a hideous creature, and she's ostracized from her community. In other tales, she's a vengeful spirit, haunting individuals who wronged her or her family, and she's associated with the sounds of mourning, sobbing or crying in the dead of night, and her cry is said to forewarn misfortune or death. She lives in isolation near the forests or rivers and is an omen of death or misfortune. And this all sounds a lot like La Llorona from Hispanic culture, and if you've not listened to my episode about La Llorona, please do, because the similarities here are pretty striking. Now you know a little bit about some of the many forms of Aswang, let's dive into some of the spookiest tales that I could find about them. Although the Aswang is one of the most well-known and most feared creatures throughout the Philippines, there are not many well-known stories, so to speak, and the infamy of the Aswang is built more on stories told of first-hand encounters. So the stories I'll tell you today are ones that I found while doing the research for this episode and just thought you guys might enjoy. What seems to be one of the slightly more well-known or more told stories of the Aswang is the tale of Maria Labo. Primarily told in the Visayas, Maria Labo is infamous and terrifying. So Maria was an ordinary woman from the province of Capiz. She lived a humble life with her husband, who was a police officer, and her children. Desiring to improve their living conditions, Maria took a job as a domestic helper abroad, working for a wealthy family. However, her employers were not ordinary. They were rumoured to be Aswangs. During her time working for them, Maria was assaulted, cursed, and initiated into becoming an Aswang herself, a fate she did not fully understand. When Maria returned home, she seemed normal at first, but over time her behaviour grew increasingly strange. She began to act distant and displayed unusual cravings for raw meat. One night her husband returned home to find a feast that she had cooked, and he sat down, he began to eat the delicious food, and he asked Maria where the children were and if they could join them. Maria pointed to a container in the kitchen, and the husband was horrified to discover that Maria has killed and cooked his children as part of the feast. In his rage, he tries to attack Maria with a bolo, but can only manage to just hack at her face, and this is how she became known as Maria Labo. Labo is to hack at with a big bolo or knife. Maria escaped into the night, transforming into her full Aswang form and disappearing forever, and it's said that she's still out there now, hunting for humans. And this story is often told to warn children about strangers and to discourage people from abandoning traditional values for material gain. And I did actually read a really interesting article about this story, where it was suggested that it was actually her experience of systemic misfortune and violence that turned her into an Aswang, and actually becoming the Aswang liberates her from being stuck in this conventional familial construct. And I'll link that article below, as it genuinely is such an interesting comment on Filipino overseas workers and the patriarchy and how that links into folklore, so give it a read. Another story is the Aswang and the mango tree, and this is more common in rural towns in Luzon, particularly in areas where mango trees are abundant. And the story goes that in a small village there was a mango tree that locals avoided at night. People claimed to hear strange noises coming from its branches and saw shadows moving in the moonlight. One evening, a farmer decided to cut through the mango grove to get home faster. As he approached the infamous tree, he noticed a woman sitting in one of the branches. She looked pale and beautiful, but wore tattered clothes. The woman called out to him, asking for help, claiming she was lost. Despite his fear, the farmer offered to guide her back to the village. As she descended from the tree, the moonlight revealed her feet were facing backward, a clear sign of an Aswang. Terrified, the farmer ran as fast as he could, but the Aswang chased him, now in her monstrous form, with elongated wings and glowing red eyes. He managed to escape by finding sanctuary in a chapel, where the Aswang could not follow. Pretty scary, right? And interestingly, mango trees are often associated with supernatural beings in Filipino folklore, and this story underscores the idea that Aswangs can blend into the environment to ambush their prey. Also, I will say it's not hard to find many first-hand encounters of the Aswang. In fact, if you hop on over to Reddit, there are multiple threads dedicated to people sharing their experiences with the Aswang. If you want to give yourself trouble sleeping tonight, I will leave the link to one such thread in the show notes. So it's clear to see that the Aswang are certainly a big deal in the Philippines. So shall we take a look at how interpretations and tales of them have changed over time? The Aswang isn't just a relic of the past. She's evolved alongside Filipino culture. I've already told you that during the Spanish colonial period, she became a tool of moral instruction. The Spaniards cast the Aswang as a demonic entity, rather than a neutral or nature-linked spirit. She was portrayed as evil akin to witches or vampires, reinforcing the need for Christian salvation. Folklore began to include crucifixes, holy water, prayers, and other Christian symbols as effective tools to repel or kill the Aswang. At this point, stories of the Aswang were used as cautionary tales to promote moral behaviour, particularly targeting women, who were often accused of being Aswangs if they were independent, unmarried, or different. They always want us to be moral and conforming, don't they? I actually personally quite enjoy being different. During the American colonial period, the Aswang began to evolve in response to the profound social, cultural, and political changes brought by American influence in the Philippines. And this era introduced modern education, urbanization, and new scientific and psychological perspectives, all of which went some way in reframing the Aswang within the context of rapidly changing society. The Aswang then came to symbolise the rural-urban divide that emerged during this time. As urban centres like Manila expanded under American rule, there was a growing emphasis on modernity and progress, but in rural areas, they were often viewed as backward, superstitious, and uneducated. So in this context, stories of the Aswang became deeply associated with more remote provinces, where belief and folklore remained strong. Urban Filipinos began to use the Aswang as a way to characterize rural communities as places of danger and ignorance. For instance, travelling salesmen and government officials tasked with visiting rural areas would often recount tales of Aswang sightings in these regions to reinforce the idea that the countryside was a place that the supernatural still held sway. And this created a perception of rural areas as places untouched by the modern rational ideas promoted by the colonial government. And the introduction of Western science and psychology during this period also influenced how the Aswang was perceived. American missionaries and educators, who often encountered Aswang stories when interacting with rural Filipinos, interpreted these legends through a lens of sort of scientific rationalism. And they dismissed the Aswang as a superstition, rooted in fear of the unknown, and often attributed belief in the creature just to a lack of access to education. And some Western scholars even suggested that the Aswang legend could be explained as a psychological phenomenon, with its monstrous traits reflecting collective fears of illness, death, or social outsiders. For instance, certain interpretations suggested that women accused of being Aswang were scapegoats for unexplained deaths or illnesses in their communities, with their supposed transformation into monsters just a bit of a metaphor for societal tensions or anxieties. And also, during this period, the Americans brought with them an introduction of media, so print and radio, and that allowed stories to spread far more quickly and far more widely than they ever had before. Publications under American influence began to incorporate Aswang tales into magazines, into newspapers and short stories and anthologies, and often reimagined these legends in ways that reflected contemporary issues. Writers began to use the Aswang as a literary symbol of various fears, including the erosion of traditional values or the dangers of foreign influence. For instance, in some stories, the Aswang was portrayed as a shapeshifter who could mimic not just animals, but also human behaviours, making it more insidious and a more unpredictable threat. And these depictions underscored the idea that danger could come not only from the rural wilderness, but also from within your own community. So despite the push to modernise and rationalise Filipino society, belief in the Aswang persisted, particularly in rural areas where traditional ways of life remained dominant. And the Aswang continue to serve as an explanation for mysterious events like sudden deaths of livestock or disappearance of people. In this way, it acted a little bit like a cultural buffer against the uncertainties of life in a colonial society. In some regions, the Aswang even adapted to new contexts, so stories emerged of Aswangs targeting wealthy or influential individuals, reflecting tensions between the rural poor and the urban elite during the American period. And to that I say, eat the rich. If we go forward a little bit in time and have a look at the Philippines in the post-Second World War period, we find a country emerging from a period of intense conflict and devastation. Its society was deeply scarred by war and by the Japanese occupation. And the post-war period, from 1946 to about the 1970s, was a time of rebuilding and rediscovery. And this environment of cultural introspection had a profound impact on folklore, including the legend of the Aswang. The creature, already a staple in Philippine mythology, became a powerful symbol of fear, of survival, and of resilience, reflecting the anxieties of a country trying to recover from the horrors of war and forge a new identity as an independent nation. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many rural areas were left in ruins, and the struggle to rebuild communities brought the Aswang legend into an even sharper focus. Stories of the Aswang were often retold as cautionary tales again in villages where societal structures had been disrupted, leaving families vulnerable to the unknown. Stories from remote provinces often involved Aswangs preying on the weak, particularly children and pregnant women, who were seen as symbolic of the country's fragile hope for the future. In this context, the Aswang became more than just a monster. It represented the lurking dangers of an uncertain world, where traditional protection systems had been eroded by the chaos of war. The post-war period also coincided with the rise of Philippine cinema, which played a major role in shaping the modern image of the Aswang. In the 1950s and 1960s, horror films became increasingly popular, with the Aswang often featured as the main antagonist. These films drew heavily on traditional folklore but adapted the stories to fit more contemporary themes. 1959 saw one of the very first Filipino horror films to directly depict the Aswang on screen, and it was called Aswang. The film portrayed the Aswang as a vampiric monster that terrorized a rural village, drawing on its roots in folklore and the growing fears of rural decline and social unrest. These cinematic portrayals helped to cement the Aswang as a cultural icon, bringing its legend into urban settings where it became part of a broader national consciousness. During this time, the Aswang also began to take on new layers of meaning as a metaphor for societal issues. In many films and many stories, the creature was used to explore themes of betrayal, distrust, and hidden danger, reflecting the tensions of a nation still rebuilding its identity while grappling with political instability and economic challenges. For example, the Aswang's ability to disguise itself as an ordinary person resonated with fears of infiltration and subversion, echoing the broader anxieties of the time in the Cold War era. And this mirrored political climates of the time as well, where there was fear of communism and insurgency. The Aswang's presence in these narratives became a way to express this unease that was felt in Filipino society, and it was a society that was struggling to reconcile its traditional values with the rapid modernization taking place in urban centres. And then we get to the 60s and the 70s, and this time saw a resurgence in interest in Philippine folklore as part of a broader movement to reclaim and celebrate Filipino heritage. During this period, writers, artists, and filmmakers began to reinterpret the Aswang legend in ways that emphasized its cultural significance and its deep connection to the Filipino psyche. For instance, the short stories of Nick Wahim, one of the Philippines' most celebrated writers, often explored themes of folklore and myth, blending them with contemporary concerns. In his works, the Aswang and similar creatures were not merely monsters, but complex symbols of the human condition, reflecting the contradictions and the struggles of Filipino society. And his stories helped to elevate the Aswang from simple folk legend to the subject of literary and intellectual inquiry, making it a central figure in the country's cultural narrative. And at the same time, the Aswang began to appear in urban legends. Stories emerged of Aswangs infiltrating cities, blending into communities, and preying on unsuspecting victims. These tales often reflected the fears of urban Filipinos about the migration of rural populations into the urban centres, highlighting anxieties about crime, poverty, and the breakdown of traditional social structures. And one example of this was in the 1960s, there was a massive upsurge in reports of Aswang sightings in Manila's poorer neighbourhoods, and that was likely fueled by a bit of a mix of folklore and then actual real-life fears about so many people migrating into the urban cities and bringing with them this sense of upheaval or societal change. And this period also marked the beginning of a much more commercialised approach to the Aswang. Horror-themed festivals and events became popular in some regions, particularly during All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day celebrations, when the stories of the supernatural were traditionally told. And these events helped to keep the Aswang legend alive, while also transforming it into a source of entertainment and cultural pride. The commercialisation of the Aswang continued to grow in subsequent decades, but its roots in the post-war period laid the foundation for its enduring appeal in Philippine popular culture. So you can really see how the legend of the Aswang has transformed over time as it adapted to the changing realities in Philippine society. And the creature became a powerful symbol of fear and resilience, reflecting anxieties and hopes of a nation rebuilding itself after years of conflict. Through films, literature, and urban legends, the Aswang found new relevance, bridging the gap between tradition and modernity, and cementing its place as one of the most enduring figures in Filipino folklore. So where can you find the Aswang today? While reports of sightings have decreased in urban areas, rural provinces like Capiz and Antique still hold a strong belief in her existence. In fact, some villages organise rituals and ceremonies to protect against Aswang attacks, and they use garlic and salt and special prayers. In the modern era, from 2010 to now, the Aswang has undergone yet another transformation, fueled this time by the rapid rise in digital media, globalisation, and a growing interest in cultural preservation. As technology and storytelling platforms have evolved, so too has a legend of the Aswang, which now serves as both a subject of horror and a symbol of Filipino identity in a rapidly modernising world. The digital age has allowed the Aswang to reach a wider audience, both locally and internationally, while also enabling a deeper exploration of its cultural significance and reinterpretation for contemporary times. And look at you, you're listening to me, a girl sitting in her bedroom in England, talking about Filipino mythology and folklore. The internet and social media have played a pivotal role in keeping the Aswang alive and in modern consciousness. Platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok have become hubs for storytellers, enthusiasts, and filmmakers to share their interpretations of the Aswang legend. Amateur horror content creators frequently produce short films and documentaries that explore Aswang encounters, both real and fictional, often blending traditional folklore with modern storytelling techniques. One of the most notable examples of the Aswang's modern resurgence is the animated series Tres, which premiered on Netflix in 2021. And this was adapted from a very popular Filipino comic book series, and it places the Aswang at the centre of a bit of a dark urban fantasy narrative, blending traditional folklore with gritty modern-day Manila. And in Tres, the Aswang is reimagined as a sophisticated and organised crime syndicate operating in the shadows of the city and preying on humans while navigating complex relationships with other supernatural beings. And the success of Tres introduced the Aswang yet again to a global audience and sparked even more interest in Filipino folklore among viewers unfamiliar with the Philippines' rich mythological heritage. And I have watched the trailer for this. I'm not going to lie, guys, it looks very, very good, and it is going on my watch list, and I think I might make it the thing that I watch when I'm on the treadmill. If any of you guys have seen it, let me know what you think, because I'm actually very excited to watch it. In addition to its presence in entertainment, the Aswang has found new life as a cultural symbol. The growing interest in decolonisation and the reclaiming of indigenous identities has led to a re-examination of the Aswang's role in Filipino culture. Scholars, artists, and cultural advocates have begun to reinterpret the Aswang as a representation of the resilience and adaptability of Filipino traditions. In modern feminist discourse, the Aswang has been reinterpreted as an emblem of defiance against patriarchal oppression. Feminists have revisited this myth, transforming the Aswang into a figure of empowerment rather than of fear. And this shift reframes the Aswang not as a monster to be vanquished, but as a representation of the suppressed rage, resilience, and agency of the women in the face of societal constraints. And we love a little bit of female rage here at Ladies of Law. The Aswang's shape-shifting ability is seen as a metaphor for adaptability and resistance, reflecting the way that women navigate restrictive societal structures and reinvent themselves to assert their identity. The connection between the Aswang and feminism becomes even more obvious when you take a little look at it in contemporary literature, media, and activism. Here, the creature's monstrousness is recast as a critique of how patriarchal societies demonize women who challenge norms. For instance, an Aswang who preys on patriarchal institutions can be seen as a symbol of justice or of rebellion, and this reinterpretation aligns with feminist themes that question and dismantle traditional power dynamics, casting the Aswang as a subversive figure that thrives on breaking boundaries and exposing the hypocrisies of those in power. And then you've got the Aswang's link to motherhood and reproduction, and this adds a whole new layer to its feminist resonance. As a figure that preys on fetuses or pregnant women in folklore, the Aswang has traditionally embodied fear surrounding female reproductive power. But feminist reinterpretations view this motif as more of a commentary on societal control over women's bodies. So by reclaiming this part of the narrative as well, feminists explore how the Aswang defies the commodification of women's reproductive roles, symbolising a rejection of the expectation that women's primary purpose is childbearing. This embrace of the mythological figure of the Aswang underscores the broader movement to reclaim narratives that have historically marginalised or vilified women. By revisiting and reinterpreting this kind of folklore, feminists are able to challenge the traditional binaries of good versus evil and explore a nuanced intersection of gender, power, and cultural identity. The Aswang therefore serves as a bit of a reminder of how folklore can be a tool of oppression, but also a source of liberation, depending on the lens through which it is viewed. Through the Aswang, modern feminism finds a voice that is unapologetically fierce, embodying the complexities of womanhood in a patriarchal world. The Aswang's adaptability is also evident in the way it's been integrated into modern tourism and heritage projects. So festivals celebrating the creature have grown in popularity, such as the Aswang Festival in Roxas City, which began in the early 2000s and gained traction in the 2010s. It was a bit controversial, and eventually it did get discontinued due to pressure from religious groups, but it did highlight the potential for the Aswang to serve as a cultural ambassador, drawing attention to the unique traditions of folklore in the Philippines. And that event featured parades and theatrical performances and educational programs, showcasing the Aswang in both its terrifying and celebratory aspects. Similar events in smaller towns continue to focus on folklore as a means of preserving cultural heritage and fostering community pride. Literature and scholarly work have also contributed to the modern understanding of the Aswang. Writers like Bajet Tan, who wrote Tres, and Carl Gaverza, who runs the Spirit of the Philippine Archipelago blog, delve deeply into the historical, cultural, and psychological roots of the Aswang. And their work combines academic rigour with accessible storytelling, encouraging a more broad audience to engage with Philippine mythology. And these efforts have contributed to a renewed appreciation of the Aswang, not just as a scary woman, but as a vital part of the Philippines' intangible cultural heritage. And guess what? The link to this will be in the show notes for all you guys that like to read after the episodes. And finally, urban legends about the Aswang have also adapted to fit modern settings, often reflecting contemporary fears and societal changes. Stories of the Aswang sightings now circulate online, rather than through oral tradition alone, with reports often accompanied by photos, videos, and even alleged eyewitness accounts. For instance, in the 2010s, there was a spate of viral posts about Aswang attacks in urban areas, and these surfaced on Facebook and news sites, and that generated genuine widespread fear and discussion all across the Philippines. And these accounts, whether they're credible, whether they're real or not, they do demonstrate how the Aswang has transitioned from rural phenomenon to a creature that can exist in the digital and urbanised landscape. The Aswang's enduring appeal lies in its ability to evolve with the times, while still retaining its identity as a figure of fear and fascination. It continues to serve as a mirror of Filipino society, reflecting anxieties about the unknown, fears of cultural loss, and the tension between modernity and tradition. In contemporary storytelling, the Aswang is no longer confined to its folkloric origins. It's a many-layered symbol that can be terrifying, empowering, and even humorous. Through films, literature, social media, and academic discourse, the Aswang remains a vital part of the Philippines' cultural narrative, proving its resilience as one of the most enduring and adaptable figures in Philippine mythology. She's a reminder that monsters aren't just about fear, they're about identity, culture, and the stories we tell ourselves. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of Ladies of Lore. I've really enjoyed doing a little spooky one for you, and I hope that you've enjoyed listening to it too. If you have, please do consider subscribing wherever you get your podcasts and follow me over on Blue Sky. Link is in the show notes as per usual. I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.